Well, thank you so much, Nikhil.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about really is about how AI, but more in particular, how data is shaping cities and managing city infrastructures and physical spaces. And this has been sort of becoming increasingly part of my work and part of a lot of people's work in this particular field. And the reason this has been happening so much is because we are trying to instrument our cities dramatically. So we've moved from when I first started out in this field, the data sets that you would get are from US census that came in once every 10 years or so. And then you understood, you thought that's where people lived and that's where people worked. And now you can figure out how to provide services for folks in these areas. But that has essentially gone away. These kinds of large-scale government-driven public data sets have been increasingly replaced by fairly localized, fairly responsive sensor networks that are collecting information using embedded sensors that are in the ground or that are airborne sensors from satellites or drones, or administrative data sets that are coming from transactions, such as whenever you sort of take rent an Uber or take out a bike share for a ride or whatever that might be. So all of these kinds of new forms of data are coming online, except that these are data sets that are increasingly being controlled primarily by private sector and increasingly used for particular benefits, not necessarily for public good. So that's one major shift that has happened in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years or so. It's been happening for a long time, but that is that's been predominantly, you can see that fairly often in this particular field. The other bit that I wanted to talk a little bit about is also that there is the data sets that we work with about cities and about places are incredibly messy and come from census and collection efforts that are varied. And one of the trickiest things that we have to do is to figure out how to fuse these data sets. So you could have a sensor network that has a resolution on traffic for every minute or so, but you can only have licensing information or vehicle registration information that happens every year or so, and they're all incredibly complicated to talk to one another. But fusing these kinds of data sets are going to be the way in which we can answer some of the questions that have plagued city planning profession for a while. The other bit that I also sort of want to talk about is the changing nature of space and or changing nature of place. It's not so much as the physical infrastructure that's changing, and that's changing too with advances in technology, whether it's transportation or whether it's financial technology that changes the shape of cities. But it is the changing nature of work and changing nature of opportunities. So more and more we are looking at what is effectively called platform urbanism, where work and play and transactions and interactions are mediated through these platforms that are effectively public but privately owned. And so there are issues associated with what this means for our places, what this means for our for future urban life. And so that's, I think, some of the key points that I wanted to sort of highlight, and that has sort of changed in the last year. So let me give you some examples trying to talk about these main issues. So, for example, one of the questions that we were interested in is does the federalism political system in the United States affect coastal resilience? So that's a point that we were interested in trying to understand. And what we had to do is there was a law that was enacted in 1980s, and we were trying to understand whether that had any impact on the way in which we preserve our coastlines. The way to understand that particular process is to go back and look at aerial photographs from 1980s, look at high-resolution satellite images from 2010s, look at all the administrative records on where beach nourishment had happened, where new development had come and disappeared, and how platting had happened, all that kind of stuff. So think about all the range of types of the quality of the data we are trying to sort of assemble to answer this one very simple question: do removal of federal subsidies prevent the development in coastlines, or do other local government or state government actors step in to fill the void? And it turns out that it's an incredibly hard question to analyze, even though we have fairly extensive sets of data. The trickiest part is not so much as to do the analysis. The trickiest part is really, as many of you will in this field will tell you, is to sort of figure out the quality of the data and figure out how they can be compared to one another. So that's and this involves thinking about how these systems are structured, like what are some pitfalls associated with particular interpretations, and thinking deeply about how these data is generated and how it is stored and what kinds of issues are associated with it. So I would. And that's just one example of the kinds of issues that we're talking about. There are other types of issues that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. So one of the projects that we've been working on is trying to understand what happened during COVID in terms of where people were going and how what is happening to cities and what is happening to businesses. And the easiest way, if you look for, well, not easy, in the previous times, what you had to do was to survey various places and figure out how many people are visiting, where people are going, and it's an incredibly costly effort that people undertook. But nowadays, you can effectively use cell phones, which are tracking devices that we voluntarily admitted into our lives, and use that to understand on almost by a minute basis how many people are at any given location, and make some assumptions about whether they're going to work or whether they're going shopping or doing other kinds of activities. And these data sets are not widely available, but these data sets are available, and they're increasingly available based on the apps that we have on our phone that are then aggregated and sold to public sector to figure out what is the effect of a particular event. So this could be a hurricane, this could be a pandemic, this could be other kinds of events, and then trying to figure out what is the impact of this. And we've been trying to collect this information from different sources and try to understand whether things have changed over time. You can do almost a daily tracking of the changes in volumes of traffic, changes in the kinds of visits that happen, people going to hospitals more, or people going to work more, those kinds of things. But it turns out that the challenge there is not so much that we have this large data set. The challenge is really how to get access to it in the first instance. That was a big challenge. But the second challenge is now how then could you sort of continually maintain your analytical capabilities. It turns out that it is incredibly hard to figure out who are you tracking and how are you, and if the tracking itself is representative. And if you don't have a chance of if you don't have a control over how this data is collected, you can simply assume, or you do simply assume, that you have either a representative sample, or because you think that the data is large, that is effectively a census of how people are traveling or how people are behaving in cities. And it turns out that it's not a good assumption. There are lots of places, lots of people that either put apps on and take them off, and they drop out of the sample. We know that there is a systematic bias in who uses what kinds of apps and what kinds of smartphones, therefore we then systematically undercount certain kinds of populations. One of the challenges here in this thinking about this data and cities is to think about the data generation processes itself and how those are affecting the kinds of conclusions that we are drawing about the cities, about managing cities, about the future of cities, and things of that sort. The one other thing that I do want to point out is that in this space, the conventional understanding is that public goods are provided primarily by governments. And so think of your roads and parks and those kinds of stuff. They have relatively open access. But it turns out that in the last few years, increasingly, these kinds of public goods are provided by private sector. And these would be, for example, Google Maps would be thought of, you can think of them as a public good. It's effectively used by pretty much everyone. It relies on user contribution. In some senses, it is user generated. In other senses, it is tightly controlled on who can access it and for what purposes, especially when you're using it for commercial purposes. But it has implications as what kinds of information goes into this Google Maps, and what implications does it have for the way in which we design, say, for example, our transportation system. So one example is, for example, there's a neighborhood in LA, I think, that effectively asked Google Maps to remove the streets, and I think this was Waze rather than Maps, streets from their mapping system, so that traffic cannot be routed through their networks. And it's incredibly hard to monitor what is going on in these systems when the data is held privately. And so, the challenge really is, as we are thinking about how cities are being shaped and reshaped by these sensor networks, by these data collection practices, by these new forms of institutions that are being created because of this data, and because of this, and in part because of the data, and in part because of the artificial intelligence that is associated with these large data sets. It is important to think about the social sort of implications of these transformations. And Zainab had already talked about this a little bit in the past session. But I think it's going to be increasingly challenging to view cities as places anymore. It's going to be effectively datafied, which means that you got to rethink our relations with one another. Like, how do we interact with one another? Where do we interact with one another? And what are sort of the justice implications of such interactions? And so I'll stop there, and I'll take questions perhaps later if you have any. So thank you all.